RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. Welcome to part 5 of my Build a Wine Caddy Like This One series. And in this one we're going to be putting on the front and back of the wine caddy and getting into some decorative details like the opposing arches and all the associated metal accoutrements. So let's figure out where we left off. In the previous episode, it was all about dovetailing. We dovetailed a side to the bottom. I just finished dovetailing the second side to the bottom using my shop-made dead blow mallet. And I made sure that it's square and that glue is curing right now. So what I need to do next is put on the front and the back. So I'm going to get 2 of my 4.5 by 4.5 inch square pieces here. And we're going to drill an offset hole in each of these pieces using a drill press. So this is the first time that we're getting a power tool of any kind involved here. And so we're going to do these opposing arches with the drill press, and then we're going to rip cut the pieces right through the center line of that drilled hole. And then we're going to get out the doweling jig and drill the holes that are going to accept these rods here. And I had every intention of doing this new one with copper, just like this one here. It turns out though that I don't have any copper in my shop. So I went to the hardware store where I normally pick up that kind of thing, and they too were out of copper. So I'm going to have to make an unscheduled design change. That's the kind of thing that happens once in a while when you're a studio furniture maker. It's good to be able to adapt as the things on the ground change. So what I'm going to do instead of copper, I believe, is do these steel rods, which you can pick up at just about any hardware store on the planet. And these are 1/4 inch, of course. And I'm going to blacken these. And so I'm going to use blackened rods and black oxide tacks for these little bits up here. And then I have to decide what I want to do about these nails here and here. I might use brass screws that I've blackened as well. Still pondering that one, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So let's measure out where we want this hole to be and then mark it out on our work pieces and take it over to the drill press. Okay, so let's figure out where to drill this hole. Now what I like to do in any case where there's a design decision to be made is try to come up with a whole number ratio that makes sense to me, a simple whole number ratio rather than just a random measurement picked out of the blue. So what I want to do is have a 3/5, 2/5 kind of ratio between the top and bottom of the face of the wine caddy. And there's multiple ways you can go about figuring that out. This is a 4.5 inch square piece, so I could take 4.5 inches and do the fractional math, and I'm not great at that. I'd rather not. Another way you could do it is just to get a project calculator, home project calculator that can handle fractions. That's still kind of a pain in the butt. I'd rather not. I could also just measure this in metric and divide that by 1/5 and figure that out. Again, we're still doing math. I'd rather not. So one of the ways that you can avoid all that mathing altogether is to get a pair of dividers. And if you have the patience, you can figure this out quite easily. What you do is take your dividers and set it to what you think is about 1/5 of this distance, and then just walk it out and see where you land. So I've already gone through this process, which I'll admit is a little bit tedious, but there's 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps. This is 1/5 of this distance. So what I want to do now is just walk this out like this. 1, 2, 3. Put a little divot in there. That is 3/5 of the way up and then 2/5 from the top. And then I'm going to take a square and a pencil and drop my pencil lead right into that little divot that I made with the dividers. Slide my square up to it and draw my line. So that center line is the center line that I'm going to drill my hole for the arches. And it is the line upon which I'm going to do my rip cut to separate this. Now I need to find the center line, or the center of this pencil line here that you can probably barely see, if at all. And in that case, the math is pretty easy. 4.5 divided by 2 is 2 1/4. So I'm going to go in here with my little T-rule, find 2 1/4, and drag it across. And so X marks a spot, or I guess plus marks the spot here. And what I like to do here is put a little divot right in that spot where those 2 pencil lines cross. To do that, I'm going to use this simple tool here, which is basically a modified awl, which turned into a birdcage awl. I basically sharpen this awl with 4 facets to create a point. And in so doing, I can drop that point right on where those 2 pencil lines cross and then twist it. And I can drill a pretty deep hole just with the awl. But what this does for me is give a spot for my Forstner bit spur, the center spur, to register into, and it'll make it super easy to line that center spur up now that I have a little divot there. Oakley dokley, so now I'm over here at the drill press, and I have a floor standing model. You know, you don't have to spend that much more to get a little bit bigger drill press, so I just went ahead and did it. And I haven't regretted that decision. It's got a nice big table, and I can fit a big old cabinet under here that has all my drilling stuff in it, so it's worked out well from a space perspective too, actually. And what I like to do is use a fence, of course. This is an important thing to do, not only for accuracy's sake, but also for safety's sake. Now you could go ahead and try to drill a hole with a 2-inch Forstner bit like this with a brace and bit, but if your Forstner bit isn't super sharp anymore, then that might not go very well. You could also do this with a cordless drill, but that is fraught with peril and generally advised against, because if this giant bit were to kind of catch while you're trying to hold the drill steady, if you're trying to do that with just your arms and wrists, there's a good chance you could injure your wrists. That's kind of common practice not to use big bits in a handheld drill like that. So if you can swing it, try to get to a drill press. And what I like to do is, remember I put that little divot there right where the center line of my hole is supposed to be. So I'm going to eyeball through this Forstner bit and line up the spur with the hole I put in there earlier. And then I'm going ahead and put a little bit of weight on it. And then now we'll hold everything still while I bring the fence up to the work and tighten it down. By the way, this fence is made by Lee Valley and works perfectly with this jet drill press, and it does exactly what I need it to and no more. So it's got a little stop here. Let's get that in place again. Push the stop up against there and tighten that down. So now I have a fence to push against, and I have a stop to keep it from moving laterally. And then I'm just going to hold it in place just like that. If you want to do the belt and suspenders approach, I certainly don't blame you. You can put some kind of clamp on here. I don't really have a clamp that reaches this span very well. So I'm just going to be doing it, holding it in place here. Another thing that I did is in the drill press itself, I changed the belts out so that this is spinning at a very low RPM, so the Forstner bit doesn't get too hot, but it's also a little bit safer that way too. So let's go ahead and drill this to a depth that is about roughly a third of the thickness of the board that you're drilling into. This is a 2-inch Forstner bit drilled to a depth of about 1/3 the thickness, and I just eyeballed that. And it is about 2/5 from the top and 3/5 from the bottom and centered laterally. So that is the first hole that I'm drilling, and then I'm going to drill a slightly smaller one in next. Now I've blown all the shavings off of the table here because they can get between your workpiece and the fence and screw things up for you. So I kind of cleared all that out of here. And I'm going to do the second one. And if this piece is the exact same size as this piece, and I've put the little divot in the exact same spot, put that up to my fence and against my stop, the spur on the Forstner bit should land into the same spot. And it does. So that's all reassuring. So let's go ahead and drill this second one as well. And you might get some schmutz around the edges of the hole here. That's easy to clear away later. We're actually going to go over this with a smoothing plane before we attach it to the wine caddy. Now I left all of my fence settings exactly as they were, so everything's still tightened down exactly where it was before, except I swapped out the Forstner bit for a smaller one. This is a 1 3/4 inch Forstner bit, whereas the first one we drilled partially through the board with was a 2-inch Forstner bit. And I left my belt settings on the drill press the same slow speed. Will work just fine in this case. And this time I'm going to drill all the way through the workpiece with this 1 3/4 inch Forstner bit. And it is good in this case to have some kind of backer here to keep the backside of the hole from getting completely messed up as it exits. So watch for that. Make sure you have something underneath your workpiece to support it and keep that edge from getting turned into a mess. Oh, and by the way, the safety goggles that I wear for my drill press are super fun. They're from Lee Valley. They're German safety goggles, as they call them. I don't know why they call them that. To me, they're just reminiscent of, you know, the 30s and 40s kind of safety goggles, and I think they look pretty rad, so they're kind of fun to play with. But they do kind of give you tunnel vision, and that's why I use them at the drill press, where I don't really have to have any peripheral vision to do what I'm doing. Let's go ahead and cut this next one. Make sure there's no schmutz under there, and we'll go ahead and have at it. There we go, nice clean exit hole. We're looking good. Got my holes drilled now, and now I want to cut these rip cuts that are basically bisecting the center line of the holes that I drilled. And I marked these, or went over the lines again in white pencil so I could see them better. And there's a couple of pencils I like to use for doing that. So one is just a regular colored pencil in white from the art section at the hardware store. The issue with these is they tend to get blunt very easily. It's very soft lead, and the lead is a little bit brittle, so when you sharpen it, it tends to crumble. So that's a little bit annoying, but it does allow me to make a thick line when I want to, and you can see that line pretty easily here, hopefully. If you want something a little more precise, I like to use this Fons & Porter fabric marking pencil, and it's a mechanical pencil with a white lead on it. And of course, I don't have to worry about keeping it sharp. If I want more lead, I just advance it and it stays nice and sharp. And the line isn't as pronounced, but it's enough that I can see it. So if I can find the affiliate link for this Fons & Porter, I'll go ahead and leave that in the description. And maybe you can make use of that for marking dark woods like this. And I'm going to try to do this rip cut with my big old sash saw. So this is a rip cut sash saw, and it's a little bit big for this task, but so is a panel saw. So if I can hold this steady enough on my bench hook and rip cut it that way, I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let me give it a shot and see what happens. There we go. There we go. I have a top and a bottom now. So I did those two rip cuts, and I have my front and back ready to go here. A note about this: if you have grain on these boards that is highly figured, or it just has a lot of character to it in some way, then you'll probably want to mark these in a way that allows you to keep these organized. So that one stays with that one, and that one stays with that one. So when you separate them on the front and the back of the wine caddy, the grain matches between the top and the bottom. And it's not the kind of thing that people are liable to notice, at least outwardly, but I'd like to think that subconsciously people pick up on that, and it adds something to the piece when you do it that way. The pieces that I picked are very straight grained, and I think if I reverse these, nobody would be any the wiser, subconsciously or not. So I'm not too worried about that, but in any case, I want to clean up this area that I did the rip cut on. So I'm just going to look at the grain and see which way I think it's pointing, and put it on my shooting board and have at it. Taking nice light cuts and cleaning up that rough sawn surface. Just enough. And of course I want to do the same on the other piece, such that when I put them next to each other, they match each other pretty good. Looking good. And I want to do the same thing with my two bottom pieces. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is to drill the holes for these decorative rods, or decorative tubing as the case may be. And to do that, there's a lot of ways you could go. You could try to drill this by hand, but you have to get it perfectly lined up from one side to the other. So good luck with that. I don't think that's going to work out too well should you choose to go that route, unless you just have a lot steadier hand than I do. You could also try to get this all lined up on your drill press. That technically is feasible, but what I like to do is to use a doweling jig, because that allows me to drill perfectly straight into these little pieces, and it just works out better when I do it that way. And I've used a doweling jig to drill the holes for decorative pieces like this for years now, and it's always worked out really well. So the dowel jig that I personally like to use is this Dowel Max. I freaking love the Dowel Max. This thing is just beautiful. I did a video about this, a couple of videos actually. I did a video about my old one, and then they sent me the whole kit and caboodle with a bunch of upgrades that they have done to it over the years, and then I did a video about that. So I'll try to leave the links to those videos in the description in case you want to know more about this. But whatever dowel jig you choose to use for this project, it's very important that you're able to adjust the distance of the dowel jig fence from the holes, so you can get the holes exactly where you want them to be. In my case, I have my fence screwed directly to the drilling block, and on that fence I have a spacer that is a 5mm spacer, and that gets the holes exactly the distance I want if I line it up such that the show face is my reference face, the face that's going to go against the fence in this case. And then I took a peek in there to see where I thought that hole was going to line up with the workpiece, and I want it such that the hole is just off the end of these arches that we drilled earlier. I don't want it way over here at the corner, because over here at the corner is where there's going to be a couple of screws or nails later on. So I'm going to be using the second hole here to drill into, and so I'm going to put the show face of the workpiece against the fence. And then I realized that that second hole is a little bit too close to the arch. So what I'm going to do, instead of lining the end of the workpiece up with the end of the drilling block, which is typically the reference surface you line things up with, I'm going to move it in a little bit and line it up with the spacer, that 5mm spacer that I put in there. And that just offsets it a couple more millimeters and gets that hole just a little bit further away from the arch, which you probably can't see in there, but that really gets everything lined up the way I want it to be. As far as the drill depth goes, what I'm looking to do is get, maybe an inch or so. So I didn't, worry about it too much. I just put the Dowel Max jig against the bench top and let the drill bit just drop through until it touched the surface of the bench, and then I just tighten my little stop collar there. So that's the distance I'm going to be drilling in. I'm going to drill into that second hole there, and that will get me right where I want to be. Let's pull that out. So there is the hole for that rod to fit into, and you can see that it's very near the face here, which is what I want, because I'm actually going to be removing some material here. I want these to be a little bit thinner. One thing you'll notice on my example caddy here is that there's a little lip at the bottom, and I like that. It kind of grounds it to whatever surface you're placing your wine caddy on. I want that, so what I need to do is reduce the thickness of these pieces that make up the front and the back equally. So I'm going to be thicknessing these a little bit, and because I want this little double arch here to remain intact, I'm going to take all that extra material off the back of each of these pieces. I'm going to repeat what I did here to drill this hole on the other side, and then do the same thing on both of the bottom pieces, and then we'll go to marking these such that we can thickness them all equally and keep those holes all lined up with each other just right. Okay, so now I need to thin these down a little bit. So I took a measurement off of the existing wine caddy that I have and came up with about yay much, which appears to be just shy of 3mm. I don't know what that would be in imperial, but you get the idea. And then I want to double check that I'm not taking so much off that I'm exposing this hole here. So I just hold it up to it and make sure there's some clearance, and it appears that there is. So we're good there. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark this all the way around the back side of this. And then I'm going to plane to that knife line, just like I did in the earlier video when we were doing thicknessing. Take some material off so that I have that little lip at the bottom of the wine caddy, and it looks nice and grounded visually. And I'm making the marking gauge line fairly deep because I want to be able to see it and notice it easily when I'm planing. So I want to mark all of these like that. Put it up against my planing stop. Let's see, which way does this grain look like it's running? Looks like it's running this way. And then go ahead and take lots of material off. until I'm down to those marking gauge lines. And that way they'll be the thickness that I need them to be for the design. With each of these pieces, as I get down to my knife line using my jack plane, I like to clean up any plane tracks that might be there and just kind of refine the surface enough to make it good for gluing by hitting that with my smoothing plane. So I'm just going to take a few really light passes over the back of that. And that's nice and smooth, cleans up that edge a little bit more and gives me a nice surface from which to glue this to the surface of the wine caddy that I already have started here with these dovetails. And now you'll see that when I put it in place, there's a nice little lip under there, right there. So that's going to look good when it's all said and done. I'm also going to flip each of them over, and I'm going to do the same thing to the show face of each of the pieces to clean up that surface grain. It also cleans up the edges where the Forstner bit kind of tore up the surface a little bit, so that helps clean that up a little bit better. And since I'm doing a little bit of surface prep, I may as well come over here with some sandpaper. This is 180 grit sandpaper. I'm looking at the show face here, where my little double arch is, and I just want to soften up these edges a little bit. And while I'm doing that, may as well get this edge as well. And I'm going to want to come in here with some sandpaper wrapped around my finger and clean up this edge as well as this edge, and make sure that there aren't any sharp edges or any loose fibers just kind of hanging loose from that spot there. And then these pieces will be ready to glue to the face of the wine caddy, with the exception of the rods. We have to put the rods into these before we glue these to the face of the wine caddy. So here are the sides that we dovetailed earlier, and I'm just going to hook them over the edge of the bench here. Here is a top and bottom piece of one of the sides, and they're going to end up getting glued on here like this. So this one's going to be against the base. This one is going to span the top of the wine caddy. And before I glue these on, I need to cut the rods or tubing to length to fit into these holes that we just drilled. And so in order to do that, I need to know the distance from here to here, as well as the distance of the holes. So let's measure the distance of the holes on here. For that, I'm going to use a pair of dowel calipers. They have that little stem that sticks out one end there that I can put right into that hole and drop it down until it bottoms out. That gives me 59/64, which is meaningless to me. So, and also I don't want my, my rods or the tubing to be so long that they prevent me from sliding this as close together as they need to be in order to glue into place in the right spot. So I'm going to reduce this 59/64 a little bit at a time until I get to a number that actually makes sense. There we go, 7/8. 7/8 will work. So I'm going to write down 7/8 on a scratch pad somewhere. So I got 7/8, and now I need to know this distance. So let me grab something that is in imperial. Okay, looks like we're looking at about 7 7/16. So I'm going to write that down. So what I need to do now is add 7/8 times 2, and then add that to 7 7/16. Fractions, man. Oh, I hate doing fractions in my head. So I use the home project calculator. 7/8 times 2, that one's easy enough. That's 1 3/4 inches. So I had to add that to 7 7/16, and the total I got was 9 3/16. But this just drives home one of the main reasons that I switched from doing imperial to doing metric is I just do not like trying to figure out fractions in my shop when there is an easier way. And if you want to hear more of my diatribes against imperial, I did a video about metric versus imperial, plus different measuring tools that I have in my shop that I like. And if you're curious about that, I'll leave a link in the description. All right then, so let's get ready to cut some metal. So I got my ruler and my piece of steel rod here up against a planing stop, so I know that I'm measuring pretty accurately. And I'm just going to mark that with a fine point Sharpie. I like to use that to mark any kind of metals that I'm cutting. So that's 9 3/16. And of course I'm going to be cutting on that side of the line because it's from the short end. So let's bring this over to my other bench where I don't mind getting metal shavings all over its surface, and cut this with a hacksaw. So over here at my old bench, I have an old bench hook that I'm going to use a hacksaw to cut this with. And what I like to do in this case is to just put the blade of the hacksaw right against the side of the fence here. And that allows me to kind of hold things steady while I get the cut started. Once I've got that cut started, I will move away from the fence where my kerf is to give clearance for the back end of the hacksaw not to hit the part of the bench hook that's closest to me. And that way I can use much more of the blade while I'm cutting. With that piece cut, I can now file down the edges where I sawed it to kind of relieve them. And that makes it such that I can fit the end of the rod into the holes that we just drilled. So I'm kind of spinning and filing at the same time. And any cheap file will work for this. This isn't, you know, fine work that's going to be seen later. So I've eased these edges so they're easier to put into the holes on the wine caddy. And then I just got to clean these rods up and apply some gun bluing to them to blacken them out. Now normally when I'm cutting any kind of metal like this, I would do that with a metal cutting wheel and an angle grinder. A word of caution about that, you don't want to use that anywhere there's sawdust or shavings for obvious reasons. You'll start a fire in your shop. So if I have a lot of metal cutting to do, I'll either make sure that the floor where any sparks are potentially flying is completely clear of that kind of thing. Or I'll just go right out in the back of my shop onto the back patio there where I have a stone patio. And I don't have to worry about that kind of thing. I'll just take a saw bench out there and have at it with the angle grinder and the metal cutting wheel out there where I'm not going to set anything on fire. All right, now it's time to clean up all these metal bits and get them ready to be installed, so to speak. So I'm over here at my multifunction table. I got drop cloth down because this is probably going to make a mess. I got some 400 grit sandpaper I had laying around to clean up these steel rods with. And then I chose for my hardware some little pan head or cap head screws, I guess, that are a flat head. And these are brass, so I'm going to have to blacken the heads on these to match these when they're black. And the products I'm going to use to do that with are Super Blue and Brass Black, respectively, by Birchwood Casey. And you can buy this stuff from a lot of hardware stores, sometimes sporting goods stores, anywhere that carries guns, of course. And failing that, you can order it online as well. And I'll try to leave affiliate links in the description for these products. But basically, the Super Blue here is for any kind of like ferrous metal, I believe. Of course, that doesn't necessarily work on brass, so you'll want one that's specifically for brass for blackening the heads of these screws. And so I have a piece of cloth here I'm going to apply it to the rods with. And then for these screws, I'm just going to dip the ends of the screws into the brass black here. And then I have this little pick here, and the pick I use to overcome the surface tension in the liquid to get it down into the slots. So that's what that's for. So let's go ahead and clean up these rods with some 400 grit sandpaper. So I got a nice kind of even sheen on these, although this is going to be ultimately kind of the rustic look. So if this isn't perfect, it's fine. I think it's still going to look really good. Every once in a while I'll see kind of a stripe along the length of it. That's just an area that I missed. So I'm looking at this in reflected light to see what I'm doing. So there's one. Let me do the rest of them now. So now these are all sanded up, and you can see the mess it makes. So if you have any concerns about your lungs at all, you might want to wear a dust mask when you're doing this, particularly if you're going to be doing a whole bunch of them and batching out a bunch of these wine caddies. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my HEPA vacuum hose and vacuum this up, and then we'll go ahead and blacken this stuff. All right, so let's open up our Super Blue, not the Brass Black, the Super Blue, and fold this over. Go ahead and dampen it and see how this works. Pretty much immediate blackening. Nice. So I'm going to set that aside. And I don't really need to do the ends because those are going to be inserted into the wine caddy. So I'm just worried about everything in between the ends, basically. And then I'm going to expose fresh cloth for each one of these because some of the metal that's still there, kind of the residue, I don't want to transfer that into the bottle so much. It's probably not so good for the solution to have a bunch of metal introduced into the bottle already. So I'm just going to do it like this. All right, so I rubbed that gun bluing on all of these rods. I just went over them all twice, and they're nice and black. I got those set aside over there to let them dry. And I'm going to do the heads of these brass screws using the brass black, stuff right here. And for this, I just dip the end of it. I can get the top off. I just dip the end of it in there, and I'm careful not to drop the screw, and then see how it goes. A lot of times, and that looks like that's going to be the case here, the brass black is not really taking effect because there's so much patina and dirt and whatever on top of this screw preventing it from actually getting to the metal. So what I need to do is to get some really fine sandpaper, some steel wool, something like that, and basically rub all that dirt and patina and whatever that's on it off so the brass is exposed and can be blackened effectively by the brass black. So I'm going to go and do that, and then we'll go ahead and do all of these screw heads. One of my favorite techniques for doing that is to chuck up the screw into a cordless drill and then go ahead and put my sandpaper on that head and spin away. Just like that. And you can see how different that head looks from an existing one right there. All that patina has gone away. Now, when I dip this into the brass black, it should contact the metal and actually work. So, let's see what happens. And there you go, you can see it starting to work already right there. So I just need to go through these one at a time, clean up the heads, and blacken them, and then we'll be ready to put the front and back on the wine caddy. Now we're prepping for gluing these on to the front of the case with the rods inserted. Before I do that, I need to do a little bit of prep work with some blue tape. And I want to put a piece of tape on this edge right here. Do the same thing on the other side of it. Okay, so this is what this is all about. So for these pieces here on the sides, I need to mark where to stop putting glue so I don't put glue on a show face. So that's what these 4 bits of tape here are for. And normally I'll just measure the length of these parts that I'm going to glue on here, come a little bit shy of that and just put a pencil line, but I'm already messing with blue tape, so I may as well just do it with tape. And then for these bits on here, I need to mark out with some dividers where I want to put the screw holes for the screws that are going to be affixing these to the front of the wine caddy. So that's why these are like this. So what I need to do now is decide where I want to put my screw holes. So you'll recall that these sides are exactly a 1/2 inch thick. So I want to come a 1/4 inch in, so I'm drilling into the center of those. So I'm going to draw a line here and here that is a 1/4 inch from that end. And I'll do that with my trusty ink or T rule again. So I'm just going to go ahead and put these lines like that. And that is a 1/4 inch in from that edge. So I need to do that 3 more times. So this time I'm using my little drafting dividers, which have kind of a cool center wheel on them that helps me micro adjust the width of them. And I just walked this across here until I was able to span the width of the piece with 4 steps. So that's 3 steps and 4 steps. So I want my screw holes to be a 1/2 inch in and a 1/4 of the way in from each edge like that. So this right here is going to be where one screw hole is, and there's the other. And now I can repeat that on the other side and then both sides of the other piece that I have yet to do. And that is going to be where the screw heads are going to go. And then I need to do the same thing here. So I want my screw holes to be a 1/4 of this width here in from each edge. And that will have them all spaced out nice and evenly front to back on the wine caddy. Then I'm going to take my birdcage awl that I showed you earlier and deepen each of those holes just a little bit so they're easy to see after I take the tape off. Now that all these little divots have been deepened, I theoretically can pull off my tape and still see where those marks are. Sure can. There they are. That'll work. Okay, so it's finally time. Let's glue these parts on. So what I want to do is put some glue here, 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 and here. And I'm just going to do a very thin bead because I'm not relying entirely on this glue to hold this wine caddy together. Remember, I'm going to be screwing these parts too. And I'll add some extra holding power. I'm going to put a little bit on the bottom of this one. Like that. And before I glue this on, and this is super important, you got to put those rods in there. Like that. Let's get another one in here. So I'm kind of assembling these parts like this before placing them onto the wine caddy. And I'm going to go ahead and line everything up as best I can. Looks like I got some glue where it doesn't belong right here. That's okay, I'm using high glue here. That tends to show less through the finish than a lot of other stuff you can use. If this were PVA, that would be a little bit of a disaster. So one of many reasons I like to use high glue for this. And if I just apply pressure and rub it back and forth, that'll be enough for it to set really well. But I'm going to be extra careful and go ahead and clamp this up. To do that, I'm using these little F-style clamps from DeWalt. I really like the DeWalt ones. I used to have the Irwin quick grip version of these, and I found those to be really flimsy, not really strong clamping. The pads didn't really have enough for the toe-in that I really needed. And I tried these little DeWalt ones out, and I gotta say, I like them a lot better. Make sure everything feels nice and flush here on the sides. Let's go ahead and do the top one. And I want to make sure that this is flush at the top here. There it is, all clamped on there. So let's let that dry, and then we'll drill our holes for the screws and put the screws in. But I think there's going to be some finish prep I'm going to do before I even put those screws in there. So we'll just leave that to set and come back to it later. All right, so now this is really starting to look like something. I got the front and the back on there. I got some of the metal work done. It's starting to look pretty sweet. And before you jump ahead and start putting in the screws though, I think now is a good time to try to clean all this up. So we got a little bit of a head start with that one with the front and back pieces. We've cleaned the arches up, but there's still some edges here that need softening now that it's all assembled. And we haven't cleaned up our dovetails at all yet. So they're kind of rough. You can see the marking lines and things like that. And ordinarily what I would do when I'm cleaning up dovetails like this is to do it with a smoothing plane. But the thing is, normally it's on like a drawer side or something like that where it's easier to support the sides, because if I just put this down on my bench like this and plane across the top of it, I'll end up taking shavings here, not so much here, and I'll be taking shavings here because this whole middle section is unsupported. So it's just going to move out of the way of the smoothing plane in all likelihood. And of course, there's always a chance that when I get to the end of these little bits of end grain here, this little bit of end grain here, that the smoothing plane blade might actually break some of that off, which I don't want either. And another thing you could do is try to stick something in there to support it like that. I don't really have anything that would work well for that purpose. So I think I'm just going to hit the easy button and resort to sandpaper. There's nothing wrong with doing that. So I'm going to get out my prepping weapon and sand this really good. And I'm going to even get out a belt sander, honestly. I think that might be the easiest way to do this, especially when it comes to cleaning up these dovetails. I need to remove enough material here that I think the extra oomph of a belt sander would actually work really well. Of course, you are perfectly welcome to use any of the 3 approaches that I just mentioned. They all have their own pros and cons, but they also all have merits. So even though this video is one that is heavily geared towards the hand tool user, I think I am going to use the belt sander for this because, well, 2 reasons. One is because I can, and 2 is because that's the approach that makes the most sense to me in this particular use case. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm not going to actually film myself using the belt sander because even though it's attached to a very good vacuum, belt sanders just make a lot of fine dust that gets everywhere, and I don't want it to get on my nice camera. So what I'm going to do is just tell you what equipment I'm using and how I'm using that equipment, and then showing you the results. The belt sander that I'm using is the Makita 9404. It is a beast. It uses a 4x24 belt, if I recall correctly. It's widely regarded as one of the best belt sanders on the market. It's pretty much the only good belt sander on the market in a lot of people's opinions. I will leave a link in the description, an affiliate link, if you do want to pick this thing up. It is really handy in some situations. And the belt I'm putting on here is a 180 grit belt. I'm hoping that's sufficient to clean up these dovetails without too much work. If you find that you're using a belt and it's just getting really hot and it's taking forever to get the results that you want, that's the case where you might want to back up to a rougher grit, like a 120 grit perhaps, and then come back up to the 180 and actually have another 240 grit at the ready over there that I can kind of do that last little bit of smoothing with before I go to hand sanding. I always finish with hand sanding to make sure that the sanding marks and stuff are all kind of with the grain. And of course, that also allows me to clean up any hard edges that need to be softened still. So I get out my Prep and Weapon sanding blocks for that. These things are freaking awesome too. Again, I'll leave an affiliate link in the description for those. I have these in a bunch of different colors, which tell me which one has the rougher grit and which one has the finer grit. So these are awesome. As far as work holding is concerned, I can just put my workpiece against the planing stop, and the action of the belt will just pull it into the planing stop. And as long as the workpiece doesn't migrate laterally off of the planing stop, everything's cool. And I've also oriented my dovetails so they're at the far end of the workpiece. So the action of the belt is less liable to grab chunks of end grain on my pin board and splinter them off. Of course, using a finer grit sanding belt will help with that as well. And then the last thing is doing the bottom. Obviously this isn't stable like this, so this part I'll just put in my leg vise and work the bottom of the wine caddy that way. That's a nice secure way to hold it. So that's the plan for sanding these down. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So that appears to be all we have time for in this video, but if you've been following along with this build series, just for the sake of picking up some tips, I hope you did that in this episode as well. And if you're following along and actually building the wine caddy with me, you can see now that we're in the home stretch. There's only one episode left to go, and in that episode we're going to do the lid, and then we have to do our finishing, add the screws and the leather work, and this thing will be done. It'll be all wrapped up, and then you can use your wine caddy to carry your wine to parties or gift it to a friend or whatever you want to do with it. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. Be sure to join me for that episode, and we'll see you then. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.